Washington, D.C., the most powerful city on Earth. But in 1814, Washington's future was in serious jeopardy. A British army has stormed the city.
It's a huge blow to the American sense of honor and pride.
The White House and Capitol buildings are ablaze.
The seat of the American government had been destroyed.
A city abandoned to its fate, leaving only the weather to save it. Around the world and throughout time, weather has played a part in the fortunes of mankind. Violent events in our planet's atmosphere have transformed history. These are the stories of weather that changed the world. Imagine a world where Washington, D.C. is not the capital of the United States. A world where America is not master of its own destiny. During the War of 1812, this unthinkable scenario almost became reality. America is at war with England over free trade. In British-controlled Canada, an American army had ravaged the towns of York, Newark, and Port Dover. And the British wanted revenge. In a daring raid, they attack Washington, D.C. 200 years ago, Washington was a very different place. The capital consists of just 350 buildings, surrounded by open fields.
Around the grounds of the White House, there was no fence. Literally, animals would graze on the lawns of the president's house.
But what the city lacks in size, it makes up for in symbolic importance. It is the seat of American government, the beating heart of the nation. And now, it's under threat. August 19th, 1814. War has been raging for over 2 years. The British land 4,500 troops on the banks of the Patuxent River in Maryland. From Benedict, they face a 40-mile march to reach their goal, Washington, D.C. With temperatures approaching 100 degrees, the distance is tough on British soldiers. They must battle the weather as well as their enemy.
As the British marched on Washington, D.C., most of them were wearing their winter woolen uniforms. They were facing humidity and heat that they had never experienced before in their military careers. Some of those men actually died of heat exhaustion during that march, before the battle even began.
After 4 grueling days, the troops arrive at Bladensburg, Maryland.
The British finally reach the port town of Bladensburg, which is located right here on my left on the east side of the river. On the opposite side, about 6 miles away, is the capital city of the United States, Washington, D.C.
The city isn't prepared for the attack. The American government hastily assembles an army to defend the capital. A force largely made up of poorly trained part-time soldiers. President James Madison arrives to rally the 6,000 troops. Many are exhausted, having marched through the night to get to Bladensburg.
The fate of the American capital is going to be decided right here. Truthfully, this is the battle for Washington.
In contrast to the American militia, the British are a well-trained, well-disciplined unit. Many are battle-hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. They are under the command of Major General Robert Ross, a courageous and ruthless soldier. The battle for Washington takes place during the hottest part of the day.
The heat and humidity during this particular battle affected both sides, but it particularly affected the British because they were so unaccustomed to it.
And to begin with, the American army keeps the British at bay.
When the British got here, they had to get across this river. Just in front of the bridge that you can see right here existed a narrower bridge than the one that we're on right now. Only 3 soldiers could stand shoulder to shoulder. Ross orders his men to attack across that narrow bridge, and they're like sitting ducks. The cannon open up, the sharpshooters open up, all of the militiamen open up. You can imagine there was a lot of casualties, and it did cause, initially, the British to fall back.
In spite of the heat, British superiority soon begins to show. A second wave of troops makes it across the bridge, and the well-drilled redcoats are quick to overcome the American volunteers. After just 3 hours of battle, they are defeated. The force that is supposed to protect the capital of the United States turns and flees into the countryside. Soldier Charles Ball described the American retreat as like sheep being chased by dogs. British victory comes at a price. 64 soldiers are dead. At least 18 of those are due to heat exhaustion. But despite their losses, Washington is now firmly in their sights.
After the Americans had evacuated the battlefield, the road was completely open and free for the British to march right on into Washington.
Revenge for American atrocities in Canada will be theirs. The future of the capital hangs in the balance.
When it became clear to the citizens in the city that the Americans had lost the Battle of Bladensburg, there was panic. All of the members of the president's cabinet were fleeing the city. The American government no longer occupied Washington, D.C.
Terrified citizens scramble to leave the city.
The British troops have entered the city of Washington, D.C. They're marching on this very road that we're standing on now. They're only 500 yards from the Capitol building, and then suddenly, right off here to my right from that building, and from some of the upper windows, shots ring out. The horse on which General Ross is riding is killed. One of the British troopers is killed, another one is wounded. In retaliation, they quickly storm the house, they burn it, and then from there, the British march on to the Capitol.
British soldiers set light to the Capitol building and the Treasury before entering the White House. They find a table set for dinner and help themselves. One officer takes James Madison's hat and declares that if they cannot capture the president, they will parade his hat in England. After dinner, General Ross orders his men to torch the building. The White House is quickly engulfed in flames. A British soldier later recalls,
"The sky was brilliantly illuminated by the different conflagrations, and a dark red light was thrown upon the road, sufficient to permit each man to view distinctly his comrade's face."
Washington is ablaze.
This is the first and only time that a foreign power had occupied the nation's capital. And when the British were here, it was almost as if hell had literally come to the capital city of the United States.
During the War of 1812, British troops occupy Washington, D.C. after defeating an American army on the outskirts of the city. It's the latest battle in a war that has been raging for 2 years. As night falls, they set fire to the heart of American government, burning the White House and the Capitol building. Next morning, soldiers continue their destruction of the city, setting fire to the State Department and the War Office. But British plans are about to be disrupted. A cold front is heading towards Washington. And when it collides with the hot, humid air above the city, all hell will break loose.
They're expecting an attack from the Americans, but instead they're assaulted by something completely different.
In the early afternoon, as if in judgment on the invaders, clouds begin to build. An almighty storm hits the city. It turns day into night. Its fury catches the British completely by surprise.
The British soldiers were terrified. The winds were so strong that some of them literally threw themselves onto the ground just to try to escape the winds.
A soldier describes the event.
The storm lasted for nearly 2 hours without intermission, during which time many of the houses spared by us were blown down. 30 of our men buried beneath their ruins.
The ferocity of the storm leaves 30 British troops dead. Thunderstorms are common in Washington, D.C. during the humid summer months.
A typical setup in D.C. for thunderstorms might be the warm and humid air sitting over the city. Temperatures are rising throughout the day as the sun beats down. You've got moisture because the Chesapeake is right next door. And so those are the ingredients that you'll look for to see thunderstorms forming.
All that's needed is a trigger, and it's thought a cold front sweeping in from the northwest was the catalyst for the 1814 storm. It forces warm, moist air to rise. As it does so, gigantic clouds begin to build. Rising as high as 9 miles, these forces of nature begin to intensify, growing into violent storms.
With thunderstorms, there's usually a tipping point where all of a sudden the air really starts to rise and the storm just starts to go. So you can go from blue sky to a severe thunderstorm in 30 minutes.
But weather as violent as the storm of 1814 is a rare occurrence. Experts have long puzzled over this history-making event.
We don't have a storm site to go visit today, but we can look through the reports and the eyewitness accounts and the letters that people wrote at that time and go back and figure out exactly what happened there in Washington, D.C.
By examining these accounts, Eric Fisher hopes to reveal the true nature of the storm for the first time.
A lot of the damage described here is roofs ripped off, tossed around, some homes demolished, trees being taken out of the ground, and these are all signs of a very severe storm.
And if conditions are right, a thunderstorm this powerful can spawn an even more deadly force. In 1814, a British army occupied Washington, D.C. and set fire to government buildings, including the White House and the Capitol. But a violent storm stopped them in their tracks. Contemporary accounts reveal its terrifying power.
There's one that really sticks out, and it's an account by George Glebe. And he says roofs of houses were torn off and whirled into the air like sheets of paper. Such was the violence of the storm that 2 pieces of light cannon were fairly lifted from the ground and borne several yards to the rear. So you're talking about a storm that is ripping up houses. It's lifting 600-pound cannons, and there's really only one force that can lead to those types of reports, and that's going to be a tornado. Likely an ep02, maybe even ep3 tornado, certainly winds in excess of 120 miles per hour.
Tornadoes generate the most powerful winds on the planet. Rotating at speeds up to 300 miles per hour, they are unimaginably powerful. And when they make contact with our towns and cities, they become one of the most deadly forces on Earth. In 1814, most buildings in Washington were built from timber. The damage a tornado can inflict on such basic wooden structures is extreme.
It's almost unfathomable the type of damage that a tornado can produce. So certainly a tornado could pick up a cannon, it could turn timber, pieces of homes into lethal weapons.
To see just how lethal this flying debris can be, Eric needs to simulate a tornado-strength wind.
Hey, Scott, good morning.
How you doing?
Good to see you.
Professor Scott Schiff uses an air cannon to study the impact flying tornado debris has on buildings. Air is stored at high pressure in a tank. When released, it propels pieces of debris at high speed.
I think the tornado that came through Washington, D.C., 1814, winds were probably at least 120 miles per hour. Can we simulate that with this machine?
With this air cannon, we can just adjust the pressure and create a missile that's traveling from 100 to 150 miles per hour.
So let's get started.
This section of test wall is built just like many of the buildings in Washington.
You've got some wood and white pine siding, timber frame, and a coating on the back. And what we're going to do now is send some debris through it and see what happens. This type of 2x4 would have been very typical of the type of debris tossed around by a tornado.
I just push it all into the back.
All right, there we are. Just need a little air.
All right, so let's go ahead and pressurize to 35 PSI.
Getting up just about into the sweet spot here. All right, we've got our safety guys down the street here, and we'll be ready to go.
Clear.
All right, 3, 2, 1. Ow! That board's still going.
The results are frightening. The 2x4 hardly slows as it smashes through the 5-inch wall.
That's one 2x4 and one wall. In a storm, there's all sorts of debris flying around at high speeds. When you're talking winds over 120 miles per hour, it's not just 2x4s going through walls. Basically, anything that's not tied down is going to be on the move.
Some buildings in the city were built from brick or stone, so Eric wants to test out another section of wall.
3, 2, 1, fire.
Whoa! So we didn't make a hole this time.
But the flying debris does shatter into dangerous splinters, and many of the British troops were out in the open when the tornado hit.
For a lot of British troops, jumping in behind a brick structure wasn't really an option. They were caught outside, and that is the last place you want to be when a storm of this magnitude is moving in. All they could do was throw themselves onto the ground, into a ditch, and hope for the best.
As well as strong winds, thunder, and lightning, the storm also produced torrential rain. Would this be enough to save the blazing city from total devastation? "200 years ago, Washington, D.C. was torched by British troops and hit by a deadly tornado. But the storm that ravaged the city also helped save it. Without it, Washington might not have remained the capital of the U.S.
In Washington, D.C., these storms can dump tremendous amounts of rain, up to 4 inches of rain per hour.
Raging fires are quenched by the sheer volume of water.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that the severity of the storm, accompanied by these drenching rains that could have lasted for up to 2 hours, they certainly helped to extinguish those fires.
The Capitol building and the White House were built from a mixture of stone and timber. While the fire destroys the wooden roofs and interiors, rain saves the outer stone walls from total destruction.
Of that original shell, that burnout shell, maybe about 1/3 of it still survives and was reincorporated into the structure that you see today.
But the impact of the storm was felt most by the British soldiers. They were literally battered into submission. Once the storm passed, General Ross waited for the cover of night and ordered British troops to slip quietly from the city.
The storm was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it destroyed some of the buildings. But on the other hand, it helped to put out some of the flames. And it probably also encouraged Ross to decide to withdraw from the city.
The seat of American government lies in ruins. President Madison is under pressure to relocate the capital to New York or Philadelphia. For a time, the future of the city hangs in the balance.
The local banks, realizing that this would be detrimental to their operations, put up the funding necessary to make it possible to rebuild those buildings so that the government remained here in Washington.
The British occupation of the city came as a wake-up call to the American government and served as a catalyst for a change in U.S. foreign policy. Never again would an enemy force occupy the nation's capital. In the years immediately following defeat at Washington, the U.S. Army tripled in size. Additional warships were commissioned for the Navy, and a network of forts built to protect the East Coast. For the first time, the United States took its place on the world military stage.
You could say that the war really made the United States military what it is today, the strongest military that exists in the world.
Strange as it may seem, a rare tornado in our nation's capital helped lay the foundation upon which the strength of modern America is built.